Fibro fam, welcome to another episode of Pass the Spoon. I'm Michaela, and today we'll be discussing, well, why is fibromyalgia?
I'm gonna ask you this one time. Where is Gamora? Yeah, I'll do you one better. Who's Gamora? I'll do you one better. Why is Gamora?
Although the exact cause of fibro isn't known for sure, research in the last decade and a half has started to point in some rather interesting directions. So, without further ado, let's look at what the research says. First, a 2006 study published in Arthritis Research and Therapy looked at the prevalence of fibro in family units. 58 offspring of 20 mothers with fibro were observed. As it turns out, 28% of their children later developed fibromyalgia. The same study then looked at 30 female fibromyalgia patients and 117 of their spouses and close blood relatives. While 19% of their spouses had fibro, what's interesting is that 26% of the blood relatives also had fibromyalgia. This broke down into 14% of male relatives and 41% female relatives with fibromyalgia, which points to the ever-familiar gender divide in fibro patients. Women just seem to be more likely to get fibro, which makes me wonder if any of the genes linked to fibro are more prevalent in females or if they're linked to the X chromosome. Sadly, I'm no expert in genetics, so I'll have to leave that to the researchers. Which brings me to the 2019 study that did find 4 genes linked to fibro: SLC64A4, TRPV2, MYT1L, and NRXN3. Building off of fibro running in families, these researchers were able to find that these genes were responsible for up to 50% of likelihood to get the syndrome. However, genes aren't the whole picture. A 2020 study in the Expert Review of Neurotherapeutics found that the prevalence of PTSD in fibro patients is around 56%. They found that both differing expressions of dopamine-associated genes and abnormal cortisol secretion have been linked to both fibro and PTSD. Another 2020 Spanish study published in the Journal of Traumatic Stress studied 173 fibro patients and 53 controls. They found that the fibro patients reported a higher percentage of trauma exposure, more traumatic experiences, and more PTSD symptoms. The fibro patients with PTSD symptoms also had more of the major fibro clinical symptoms. So suffice it to say that trauma and PTSD seem to have a close link with fibromyalgia. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention the similarities between fibromyalgia, CFSME, and long COVID. I had planned on making a whole episode about that, but while writing this, I found out that SciShow beat me to the punch. They, of course, have way more experience in science communication than I do. And they also have Hank Green, so they obviously do the topic a lot better justice than I ever could. I highly recommend that you watch that episode, which I've linked in the description below. They do a fantastic job, as always, so it's really worth the watch, especially if you're interested in learning about post-disease syndromes and how it's highly likely that fibromyalgia is one. Which brings up the question. We have evidence that fibromyalgia is caused by genetics, trauma, and illness. So which is it? Well, when I got to this point in researching this episode, one word was on my mind: epigenetics. Epigenetics is a study about how external factors can influence gene expression. A common way of describing epigenetics is to think of your genes as a light switch. The switch controls whether the gene is on or off, and it's possible for something in your environment or lifestyle to flick that switch. The thought that fibromyalgia is epigenetic is actually confirmed in that 2019 study that found that genes were tied to fibro in the first place. They found that epigenetics were implicated in stress response, DNA repair, autonomic system response, and subcortical neuronal anomalies, or disruption in how the neurons in the brain can develop. Furthermore, if you remember the study I mentioned on PTSD that found that there were differences in dopamine-associated genes in both PTSD and Fibro patients, those differences are due to epigenetics. So if you think of genes that switch as you age, you might consider them as ticking time bombs. They'll go off after a certain amount of time. I like to think of Fibro as a landmine. You have to bump into it with something to set it off. In my family, I've observed that while everyone with Fibro has had trauma to a certain extent, all of us have had an illness or an injury that triggered the Fibro. Again, I'm not an expert, but I think it would be interesting to see if trauma is what can activate Fibro genes so that if something else bumps into that landmine later, it goes off. That 2019 gene study made another interesting discovery. The Fibro genes that were set off were found in multiple tissues, which may be why it's so difficult to pinpoint the exact system in the body where Fibro originates. Is it rheumatological? Is it neurological? Muscular? This may not come as a huge surprise to anyone, but a couple of preliminary studies have started pointing to autoimmune. A 2021 study at King's College in London injected some mice with antibodies from Fibro patients and others with antibodies from healthy subjects. The mice with the antibodies from Fibro patients developed increased sensitivity to pressure, temperature, as well as having reduced grip strength. No change was observed, however, in the mice with healthy antibodies. But don't worry about the Fibro mice. Those mice recovered a few weeks later once the antibodies had cleared their systems. Since their bodies weren't making the antibodies like we do, they don't have the constant symptoms and flare-ups like we do. A rather interesting study published in Scientific Reports in 2017 created microglia-like cells from human blood monocytes. That is, they created the cells resembling the immune cells in the central nervous system, the ones that are responsible for cleaning up dead and damaged nerve cells and disease, from immune cells found in the blood. They used the cells from 14 Fibro patients and 10 healthy patients, and found that the cells made from the Fibro patients express a signaling cytokine called tumor necrosis factor alpha. It sounds scary, but TNF-alpha is in charge of a lot of important processes, including getting rid of dead and damaged cells. The TNF-alpha seemed to be triggered by ATP, which, if you remember high school bio, it's the form of energy your cells use to function. This study suggested that the immune cells in your central nervous system are hypersensitive to ATP, so they may be just getting a little too fired up in Fibro patients. This does need to be taken with a grain of salt, though, as this study had a relatively small sample size. It could be an interesting launching point, though, for further studies about the immune connection with Fibro, particularly if the immune system is targeting the nervous system like it does with MS. Again, all these studies are only pieces in a much larger, more intricate puzzle about what causes fibromyalgia. However, the more informed we are, the better decisions we can make for our health. Also, these are interesting topics for future study that help me develop more useful therapies for us aside from just symptom management. If our Fibro genes are switched on, we may eventually find out how to switch them off. Before we go, I'd like to extend a huge shout out to my friend Anthony, who has been a huge supporter of the channel. He's our biggest promoter and has even named us, so without his help, I'd still be workshopping names. If you found me via Reddit, that is also Anthony's doing, so I'd like to thank him for all that he's done to help. Also, thank you to my mom, Tammy, who is the reason there's no distracting border and watermark on the video this week. My video editing app has a free version and a relatively inexpensive subscription version. My mom was nice enough to pay for the subscription so that I could get rid of that border. So thank you, Mama, for being my channel's first sponsor. And thank you all for watching my videos. I'm still learning how to be confident in front of a camera, so thank you for your support despite that. May you be well, Fibro fam. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe. This tells YouTube to bring my content to more folks with Fibro